Good morning. Welcome to 10 Minutes of Torah. I hope you're having a nice day so far. Last week, we talked about the fact that we're currently in the period of time known as the 7 weeks of consolation. What is the consolation over? The consolation is over the events that took place thousands of years ago on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of Av. The basic event that was the highlight loss was the destruction of both the first and the second temple. And so after Tisha B'Av, we have 7 consecutive weeks where the readings in the Haftorah are geared towards offering words of solace and comfort. We spoke last week about the way the first one is the most prominent one. It's known as Shabbat Nachamu. And we talked about the fact that it says, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. You're welcome, Robert. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami is 2 times comfort. And we talked about why we need 2 levels of comfort. Today I want to develop that a little further and take it in a different way. But first, a little Kabbalah. Who's up for a little Kabbalah? Good. So, when we talk about Kabbalah, we're talking about God. What are we talking about when we talk about God? So, we have to strike a balance in our efforts to understand God between over-humanizing God in our efforts to understand the conceptual framework of God, based on the premise that man is created in the image of God. And what that says theologically is that if one knows oneself, then one has a starting point from which to understand God. But we have to be careful not to overdo it and not to lose sight of the anthropomorphic nature of that metaphor, so to speak. But at the same time, we can't undervalue self-knowledge as a key to godly knowledge. So, right at the beginning of all of this, where was God? And what was going on with God before creation from the perspective of Kabbalah? And the best way for me to explain it without or running the risk of sounding slightly sacrilegious, God was like a bachelor, living alone and not needing to concern himself with what anyone thought, with what anybody needed. No attachments, no responsibilities to anyone other than himself. And it's, in a certain sense, it's a fun life, because you get to exist and function in a way that, assuming you have a healthy self-image, you get to actualize your individual self, to be yourself. You don't have to, if you choose to, that's your choice, but you don't have to customize yourself to the expectations of others. And that's what God was. He was just himself. In fact, Maimonides, in describing God, says that God, one of the overarching characteristics of God is mitziuso me'atzmuso. His existence is from himself, meaning nobody created God, and God's sense of self derives from his knowledge of his own self. So God is not dealing with a lost self and compensating for that void by being everything to everybody else externally to compensate for the internal void. Then God says, okay, but it's lonely being a bachelor. And so he creates others, otherness, or in Kabbalistic terms, worlds, separate consciousness. In this case, it was a planetary and human consciousness. But till that actually materialized, there was a lot of experimentation, because while God was sure that he wanted an other, it took a while to get from the idea of someone else to the actuality of someone else. And in the beginning, it says God created the world with the 10 powers. And in the Kabbalistic or Lurianic scheme of creation, God put himself out there so strong that he essentially overdid it, and existence couldn't materialize from the intensity of that flow of energy. So God, it says that the lights went into the vessels and the vessels were shattered. And so God had to readjust. In order for an other to exist, he had to really pull himself back. That's the idea of tzimtzum, of scaling back himself and creating an empty space. In that empty space was the fertile ground where the seeds of an other, the possibility of otherness, was born. And if you think about it from a godly perspective, it's sometimes a little abstract and hard to wrap your head around. But if you think about it in terms of human relationships, it makes a lot of sense. So much of what we struggle with in human relationships, in marriage, is striking the right balance between self and other. And sometimes we go to extremes. We are in a relationship with somebody else, but we're still used to being a bachelor. So we're not thinking about the other instinctively, automatically, and it takes time. Now, part of being in a successful relationship is trust. The trust that the person that you're with will accept your gift of self graciously and not overdo the process, not take advantage or abuse the process, which is like pulling a person who's a bachelor to the opposite extreme, where they are so tied up in being present for someone else that they overdo it and they lose sight of themselves, which is not the point. So there's a lot of There's a lot of work that goes into. Somebody once said that when you go to get married, you go out to get a marriage license, but what you're really looking for is a work permit, because it takes a lot of work to make those adjustments.
That's right.
But putting that aside for a second, if you look at all the periods in history where God was very present, those were periods of time that could be characterized as God tinkering with the proportions of self and other. And so during the period of the first temple, or the second temple even, God's presence was very strong. Or when the Jews were in the desert, and God was working through the agency of Moses. So the God presence and his surrogate, the Moses figure, was a kind of a extension cord of a godly presence. Just like the temple was such a godly place, such a high concentration of godly energy, that it was like living with God as a bachelor, where God was with the Jewish people, but still very much with himself. And the structure of the relationship was more of a seduction on God's part than a interdependence, where two people or two entities scale back enough of themselves to discover an other. Here it was more, God was the dominant partner or figure in the relationship. Now there's something nice about that. There's something nice about those romantic stories where a person is taken by someone. If you look at the language, taken, or swept off their feet, or falling in love. So the upside to all of that is being just seduced and being swept away.
Right.
But the downside of it is that you're falling, you're swept away, and you're not you. You're being held, it's like almost a reattaching of the umbilical cord just to a new mother, in a certain sense. And
Too much.
it might be compensating for that.
Yeah.
But we're not going to get into the depth of that. And so, while it's comforting and everything in proportion, it's okay if it's not going to characterize the duration of the relationship. The ultimate goal of a relationship is for two people to truly flourish and be the best that they can and need to be in life to fulfill their individual purpose. If we're here in this world with a separate consciousness and a personality, that means that we have uniqueness and a holiness that is indispensable, that the world needs. Like Rabbi Nachman said, the day a person is born is the day that God realized that the world couldn't survive without them. But if that uniqueness is consistently suppressed, then there's something wrong with that picture. So in many ways, there was a downside to God pulling back in the instance of the loss of the first and second temple. It was a tragedy. It was a grief. But on the other hand, it was also an opportunity for the Jewish people to go through the process of a spiritual and emotional individuation, a surfacing of the self in the service of the world and God and the universe. And in that sense, there's something powerful. Just like when a bachelor gets to the point where he's in a relationship and starts to remember that he's a husband, not a bachelor, and creates room for someone else. And so the first comfort is the comfort over the loss. Right. The loss of the flying sparks. Right. The sensation of being swept off one's feet is the most unbelievable sensation. The notion of just letting go is powerful, but it's not meant to be a permanent feature. So the second comfort is essentially the comfort in knowing that we suddenly have been granted an opportunity to reclaim ourselves, our sense of self, our appreciation of self, our love of self. And by the way, it doesn't have to be narcissistic.
Right.
So gesund. There's a difference between self-centeredness and selfishness. Self-centeredness is an unhealthy reclaiming of self. But there can be a selfishness that is a reclaiming of self without the toxicity of narcissism and self-centeredness. That is critical for the personal development of a human being.
Independence.
Correct. And where is the comfort if we're losing something? The comfort is in the knowledge that what we're losing is supplemented by a gain that is actually strengthening the relationship overall. So if before there was merely a we in the relationship that was very much a product of a dominant I, and the loss of the other I was a deficit in the relationship, even though it's hard to realize that. In this schematic, where God has scaled back even more, he hasn't gone away.
No.
He's here as much as he was before.
Withdraw, back off.
It's the difference between God as a helicopter God and God as submarine God. He's always there. He's just not all-encompassing.
Yeah.
And he is extending an invitation for you to be yourself fully. And so, with the loss of a Moses-like figure, there's the need for the comfort that we have to have at that loss, but there's a second comfort, and that's the comfort of us moving in to our own void and filling it with a sense of ourselves, and learning to trust in the beauty of ourselves, and learning to value the uniqueness and beauty of who we are, and that we are needed in the universe because of who we are, not in spite of that.
Beautiful.
And so it's a transition. And on one hand, We need comfort because there's a lot of fear for a person who has lived their life in perpetual codependence mode, where they exist to enable other people. And it's about transitioning from reacting to the things in our life to a place where we can learn to respond to the things of our life. When we react, it's an instinctive, what do I need to do to guarantee your happiness, even if it's at the expense of my own? Responding means that we get to think things through from a different perspective, and we create healthy boundaries and borders, and we are aware that we have a choice, and we can think about what is a healthy yes and what is an unhealthy yes.
Right.
And we can also think about when we need to say no. And to think about a healthy no. There's unhealthy no's, and there's a healthy no,
Right.
which is tied to a trust in oneself. And so it's a big transition, and we need comfort. We need additional comfort for that, because oftentimes people go through life compensating for the void that they feel inside by acting out in the external world, managing the external world to compensate for the sense of self-hatred and self-loathing in the inside world. And what these weeks tell us and encourage us is to learn about how to stand on our own without the temple being a surrogate version of our emotional energy, without Moses holding us, without God seducing us.
Right.
We can still be the best that we can be. And here's the ultimate comfort, coming full circle to the Kabbalah. By being the best self that we can be, we are also being the most godlike. Because God is self-made. And the more we can be authentic and exist in the world not as a reaction to what we believe the world expects of us externally, but as a result of who we are internally, then we are being more godlike. Now that's difficult and challenging, but it's a comfort to know that that's the direction we're heading in. Yom Tov.
Yom Tov. Thank you, Rabbi.